and secondly went to jail in the Quit India movement. That was a very good example of how they chose quite deliberately to encourage a rival body. And there are lots of quotes in the book showing how that was deliberate.
Are we paying the price for that even today? Are we paying the price for that even today, that policy of divide and rule?
Well, partition.
Or do you think that, well...
Partition in that form would never have happened without the British.
And also Hindu-Muslim relations in this country, because yes, on the face of it, I think it's been remarkable. The India story has been quite remarkable, but then the tensions do surface from time to time.
Well, I think the whole definition of sectarian interests created both entrenched notions of those religious interests as well as responses to them. So the moment you start deliberately encouraging the creation of separatist Muslim consciousness, you will inevitably provoke a sort of Hindu chauvinist response in some. And that certainly happened. And this notion of thinking of your interests in purely communal terms really is grounded in the British
policy.
We have so many interesting examples of, for example, I mean, this has been found also in recent scholarship of the ways in which Hindus and Muslims coexisted before the British, examples of Hindus worshipping in Muslim shrines, Muslims helping repair Hindu temples after some natural disaster, obviously Hindus thronging to the shrines of Sufi saints is a very common practice, Muslim singers singing Hindu devotional songs, the Muslim artisans of Banaras making the masks for the Ram Leela there. I mean, there's just multiple examples of the two communities sharing common things. And the British forced them to define their practices in exclusion from each other. And by the way, it went so far that even the Shia-Sunni divide in Lucknow today is a direct legacy of the British rule. Because right up to the fall of Awadh, when Wajid Ali Shah of Shatranj Ki Khiladi fame surrendered to the British, up till then, Muharram was commemorated by the Shias, the Sunnis and the Hindus jointly. It had never been an incident in which, there had never been an incident in Muharram amongst the communities. The British came and said, no, this can't be. Muharram is a Shia thing, so it has to be done only by the Shias. The Shias will be in the lead. Promptly, within a couple of years, the Sunnis started criticizing it. Trouble started. They started insulting and abusing each other. And you had the first Shia-Sunni riots over something the British had created. And there's an American scholar who has documented all this, whom I've quoted. So you look at all this, and the same with the caste system. Yeah. We had castes. We didn't have a caste system. The British are the ones who actually codified, entrenched, and classified our country and our people into ways that we have since started self-defining ourselves in ways that the British did for us. Caste had been a much fuzzier, much more fungible identity in the past. Entire caste had moved up the chain. The whole notion of the Chaturvarna system being imposed as the only way India was supposed to be was because the Brits did it. And for the Brits, the entire process of trying to understand India, classify it, codify it, categorize it, was a means of controlling it. It was a way in which, as I've written in the book, the map, the museum, and the census were all instruments of colonial rule. And this is what we saw them do.
One of the other things that really struck out for me, and again, we read about the famines and the responses at the time, but again, it's the way you've put it. About, as you said, the British cannot be accused of doing nothing during, for instance, the 1877 famine, but rather of doing much to worsen its impact. What you have argued is that they deliberately made Indian people die. I mean,
absolutely. 35 million Indians died because of British policy in a succession of famines under British
rule. And deliberately thought
Deliberately. They had three principles when it came to handling famines. First was what you call this sort of Malthusian principle that, as far as Malthus said, if the land cannot sustain the population that is born upon it, some people must die to restore the natural balance. The British believed that. Secondly, free trade principles, Adam Smith. Let the laws of the market prevail. If somebody can't afford to buy food, he doesn't get food, let him starve to death. And third was the Victorian conjugacy. They said, fiscal prudence, don't spend money that you haven't budgeted for. So on all three grounds, they did not give famine relief. And what is more, they forbade people from doing it. So when, as late as the 1870s, a conscience-stricken Englishman tried to help people who were dying before his eyes, he was threatened with deportation from India by the British for violating government policy. They said that you cannot encourage idle charity. People must die. That is the right policy. By the way, it wasn't just, in this case, directed at us. They did the same thing in Ireland, which is what happened during the potato blight of the 1840s. The same set of principles was articulated. Irish died in large numbers and many fled and migrated to America, which is why there are more Irish in America today than in Ireland, is because of British famine policy in Ireland. So,
You
whereas
also
in
talked
India...
about Churchill's role during
sorry?
the Bengal famine. Churchill's role
Oh
during
God,
the Bengal
yeah. I mean,
famine.
the Bengal famine is an
4 million
outrageous
people?
example. 4 million people died. This is 1943-44. As a result of Churchill deliberately not only refusing to help, but shipping grain from Bengal to buttress reserve stocks for British soldiers in Europe for a likely possible future invasion of Greece, which hadn't yet happened. And Churchill justified it by saying the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis doesn't matter as much as the health of sturdy Tommies, quote unquote. When Australian ships laden with Australian wheat sailed to Calcutta port, Churchill forbade them from disembarking their goods while people were dying in the streets, and the wheat was asked to sail on to Europe. When conscience-stricken British officials wrote to London telling the Prime Minister that his policies were costing an unnecessarily large number of lives, all Churchill could respond was by writing in the margin, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this vile scoundrel is the one hailed by the British as an apostle of freedom and democracy. To my mind, he is absolutely no improvement on Hitler, Mao, Stalin, and the lot. He is one of the outrageous leaders.
That's quite a statement to make. And that's why the chapters on the famine, I think, particularly stood out, because it just, shakes you out of what you thought had happened, and that's true for much of the book. The other thing, though, that again you've talked about in some amount of detail are British laws. The Sedition Law, 377, many other laws of that era continue in some form or the other today. And I know that you've taken an active personal interest, for example, in 377. The sedition law as it stands today is absurd. It continues to, I'm sure it was much harsher back then, but it continues to be an absurd colonial legacy. Having said that, why weren't these laws changed or done away with after independence?
That's a tough one to answer, because I focused on the period up to independence in my book. And indeed, the British, by the way, deliberately imposed on India a sedition law tougher than the one they had in their own country. That milder sedition law itself has been scrapped in Britain. But we still have the tougher sedition law written and revised and imposed upon us in the 1890s. And this sedition law, yes, should have been scrapped. Its principal victims included people like Nehru, Gandhi, Annie Besant, Bhagat Singh, people like this. And Nehru had said that he wanted to get rid of it, but somehow couldn't find enough political support in the 50s, because I think somehow the political class felt there were too many threats to the integrity and survival of the nation to be able to just get rid of the law. I think certainly if that was true in the 50s and 60s, when there were a lot more secessionist movements and so on, today I don't think it is true. But what's more interesting is that as early as 1962, our Supreme Court passed a ruling in which it said that sedition actually should only be seen as sedition if it involves the use of violence or the incitement to use violence. Now, that is the interpretation by the Supreme Court. But at lower levels in our country, and as you know, law and order is a state subject, state police forces and lower level judges are cheerfully applying sedition left, right, and center to cartoonists, to students,
But with respect, your government was in power for 10 years in the modern era, till just a couple of years ago.
I wasn't the Home Minister.
You weren't, but you were in that government. Your party was in power. You had a chance.
No, I
had a chance at doing
think it's sad. I mean, I have not hesitated to express my own views against it. But, the fact is that politics has seen all parties of all stamps who've been in power continue to leave this law on the books. What is worse is the fact that at these lower levels of the police and the judiciary, arrests are taking place, even though any educated person can tell them that eventually, if the appeal goes up to the Supreme Court, it will inevitably succeed, because the Supreme Court has already laid down a yardstick that unless violence is threatened or involved, you can't have sedition. And yet governments continue to leave this. I have actually introduced a private member's bill in Parliament, which will amend the sedition law to bring it in conformity with the Supreme Court's judgment. So only violence and incitement to violence. But the fact is that until that's discussed and people take it up seriously, it still remains on the books, and I think it's a crying shame.
And the same goes true for 377, which I think is a tougher nut to crack, because here you seem to have, at least the Congress party did come out and support the Delhi High Court judgment at the time. And we've seen the BJP in particular opposing this. Do you see any hope, any political consensus on this?
Well, 377 is really a bizarre little thing, because if you look at the history of India, whether Hindu India or Muslim India, there is absolutely no record of intolerance for or persecution of what today is seen as aberrant sexual behavior. I mean, go and look at the temple carvings of Khajuraho if you want to know what sort of sexual practices were accepted and understood as existing. Read the Babar Nama when Babar talks with sort of almost clinical curiosity and describes his own sexual encounters with both men and women and compares the two and so on. The fact is that there was a great deal of tolerance for various sexual practices. It's only the Victorian morality that came in and said this is bad, this is wrong, and that imposed their view and their code on us. Indians as a people had tolerated all of this, and you know, as long as people did it in their own privacy and didn't get in your face, it wasn't something that Indians were bothered about. Once the British had done it, it got entrenched as a practice. And today, the party of Hindutva is betraying 1,000, 1,500 years of Hindu practice, various Puranic texts that actually represent
and upholding
evidence of all
Victorian
this,
morality.
and upholding British Victorian values instead. So when I again try to introduce a bill that would have scrapped or read down, to put it more accurately, the provisions of Section 377, it became the only bill in parliamentary history which was not allowed to be introduced, because the BJP twice objected and insisted on a vote against the introduction of the bill, and it failed both times. So now I'm not trying that route. So you ask, is there any hope? I think the only hope is the Supreme Court, which consistently over the years has tended to actually rule in a more liberal manner on everything from women's rights to other social
I
privileges.
strongly feel that Parliament should have done. And
I agree.
And you know, I think a large portion of that responsibility does fall on the Congress party, which has ruled India for so many years. Now, forget sedition. I mean, you cited maybe, you know, there were secessionist movements and they had their reservations, so on. But you have the law on adultery, for example. If I'm not mistaken, a woman can be sent to jail for adultery, but the man cannot. I mean, why is that law in our statute?
It's a little more complicated. It is that the man who sleeps with a married woman can be sent to jail.
No, the other way around. But, I mean, there are a number of colonial era laws that are still in our statute books.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
shouldn't be there.
There's no question that the attitudes embedded in the penal code are woefully out of date. In fact, Macaulay wrote the penal code sitting behind high walls in 1837. The British sat on it for 24 years and enacted it only in 1861. So it was already a generation old when they enacted it. And having enacted in 1861, that we're still following it in 2016, 17 is
What is
insane.
the adultery law exactly? So?
With a married woman,
He gets arrested. Right. But
Because-
if a woman complains that her husband had an affair with somebody, it does?
no, it doesn't. It doesn't
apply.
apply if he is having sex with an unmarried woman.
That's right.
He-
That's where.
So
that's
the whole notion
absurdity.
is that the woman is the property of the husband.
Exactly.
That is the notion
That is-
embedded.
that is what I
and
was talking-
because the adulterer has interfered with the property rights of the husband by sleeping with his wife, that's why he goes to jail.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that a crazy law? Absolutely. Which we shouldn't have in 2017. Which we shouldn't have in 2017 and which the Congress should have got rid of a long time ago. But
Well,
among other things,
put us back in power and we'll try and do something about it.
ask them. You know, then comes the issue of atonement. And there, you know, you have argued very strongly, both in the introduction and in the last chapter as well, that you feel an apology is due from the British, particularly Jallianwala Bagh. You've cited that. You've talked about returning the Kohinoor. Let me ask you though, how much would it matter to young people today here in India whether the Kohinoor comes back or not? Why do you think, for instance, the return of the Kohinoor is so important?
Well, let me start off by saying that the debate that sparked off the book was about reparations. And I was kind of trapped into Oxford's topic. It was not my choice. And so in the debate, I said, well, forget about a monetary sum because you can't put a value on the exactions they imposed on us. Why don't we just have a situation where they give us £1 a year for 200 years to make up for their 200 years of colonialism? And which I realize, even never having served in the finance ministry, that no finance minister would want to administer a reparation like that. So it's not a realistic thing. And as far as calculating any real reparations are concerned, as one Indian journalist did after my speech, the sum involved would be so preposterously high that no one could be expected to pay it. So any figure that is credible is not payable. Any figure that is payable is not credible. Any token sum is not administrable. So I think reparations really should be off the table for us. But there's got to be some admission of wrong. And to my mind, that's where atonement comes in. I'll give you two examples. One is Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, or West Germany as it was at that time, sinking to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland in apology for what the Nazis had done to the Polish Jews. Now, what's striking is that Brandt was a social democrat. He was completely innocent of any taint of Nazi wrongdoings. Social democrats like him were persecuted by the Nazis. But as the head of the German government, he felt he owed an apology on behalf of the German people to the Polish people. It was a magnificent gesture. Similarly, this year, or rather now last year, since we're now in a new year, last year, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, apologized in the Canadian Parliament to the people of India for the Komagata Maru incident. Komagata Maru was a Japanese ship on which a large number of Indians, Sikhs and others, but mainly Sikhs, traveled to Vancouver. Basically, many of them were associated with the Gadar movement and opposition to Britain and so on. They were not allowed to land and disembark. Even sick and pregnant women, etc., were not allowed. And the ship was turned away, and pretty much everyone on board that ship perished. Many at sea and many at British hands. And it was really a blot. But the Canadians didn't kill the people themselves. They turned the ship away and the people died. But nonetheless, the Canadians apologized for that wrongdoing. Now, you take something like Jallianwala Bagh, where in a grotesque act of wanton cruelty, a British brigadier fires upon a completely unarmed group of men, women, and children gathered to commemorate Baisakhi in a walled garden. He positions his soldiers near a gate and opens up fire at the gate because the targets were so easy to hit. Practically no bullet misses a human body. It was really one of the most grotesque massacres, but accompanying it was such gratuitous racist cruelty, like the bodies lying, moaning, the wounded as well as the dead, could not be touched for 24 hours. So the wounded and the died lay without attention or even water for 24 hours, thanks to Dyer's order. Indians were forced to crawl on their bellies on the street outside Jallianwala Bagh, and if they so much as raised their heads while crawling, they were beaten by British staves. And then on top of this, the British ran a collection for Dyer and collected the equivalent of £250,000 to reward him for having killed Indians. And Rudyard Kipling, the other imperialist trollop, Kipling called him the man who saved India. And this was the sort of, to my mind, all of this, that is the atrocity, the cruelty, the massacre, the racism accompanying it, the gratuitous celebration of this cruelty, and finally the hailing of its perpetrator as a hero. This to me makes Jallianwala Bagh in some ways the embodiment, the epitome of all that colonialism did to our country, and that was wrong and that needs to be condemned. And to my mind, therefore, if on the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh in 2019, a representative of the British government, either a member of the royal family or the Prime Minister of the day, comes to Jallianwala Bagh, sinks to his or her knees there, and begs forgiveness, that would be a terrific. Now, I've spoken to a few senior Brits who told me this will never happen because the British had done so much in so many parts around the world. If they started apologizing in India, they would never run out of places to go and apologize, and the demands would keep coming up. But to my mind, that's not our problem. It's theirs. And there is something very special about what they did to India, because India is the only example of a thriving, flourishing civilization and economy that they destroyed. Well, a place like Singapore was a barren rock. They built it up. I mean, I would argue they don't owe any apologies to Singapore, but they do owe apologies to India. There is a difference. And the second form of atonement I do want to mention briefly, Nidhi, is to just educate their children. Right now, British are growing up completely unaware of colonial atrocities or indeed colonial history at all.
I didn't know that until I read your book, which I found fascinating.
In fact, the week this book came out in India, a Pakistani journalist in London called Moni Mohsin wrote an article in The Guardian saying that her own children had gone to the best public school in London, Westminster, public school being private school, right? And he said they'd gone to this major in history and never learned a single line about colonial history. It's just absent. The British prefer to completely brush it under the carpet. And to my mind, this is inexcusable. I remember, for example, my generation of Germans, and those a few years older than me, I was born in 56, so those born between about 45 and 56, they were never taught about the Second World War, about Nazi atrocities. These were kids whose fathers had undoubtedly been either complicit in the Nazi rule or pressed into German war service or whatever. They never talked about it. So I've talked to many, many German friends of my age or a bit older, and it was this shameful secret that was buried under the carpet that no one talked about. But by, say, 1970s, 80s, the Germans had changed completely. They were busing busloads of school children to the concentration camps and educating them in the horrors of what their parents and their grandparents had done to innocent people, so that the German children would understand why this must never be allowed to rise again in Germany. To my mind, that's the kind of spirit that the British ought to be. They should be. They don't even have a museum. In a city overflowing with museums in London, they have no museum to how much of London was built by colonial loot. They have no museum to the atrocities of slavery. They have no museum to what they did in India. And let's face it, to our own shame, we have no museum either. Go to the Victoria Memorial, and it's almost a celebration of the colonial legacy. I said to the curator there when I went there with a parliamentary delegation last year, I said, this place should be actually a museum to the atrocities of British colonial rule in India. It's a perfect venue for that.
Well, we have about 15 minutes for audience questions. So if you could please raise your hands and we can get as many questions and I'll give it to Devang Nanavati first. Is there a mic for the audience? Yeah. Thank you. Please pass the mic around when. Thank you.
So nice to talk to you on a much pleasanter circumstances with Nidhi still as the common anchor.
Fred.
We have faced off on political debates before. I have two questions. One, probably the other one is a very short question. The first is, you write an era of darkness, which you probably will relate it to the Battle of Plassey and onwards till the British rule. I do believe that if not the era of darkness, at least the era of dusk began in 1206 when the first Sultanate was established in India. Any comments on whether, what would you include that era also as an extension of where we landed under British rule? Because I think we lost a lot of culture, civilization of which you spoke of, Shankaracharya and the Vedic civilization and the continuous stream that you spoke of. And secondly, since you spoke about Hinduism and the true philosophy of Hinduism, the foremost experts in the world who have written on Hinduism in the modern world are people like Wendy Dongier, who have written Hindus and Alternate History, which I believe is absolutely rubbish. I think if that book is published in any Indian language, we will have a riot asking for the head of Wendy Dongier here, which is not fair again, of course. But will an Indian scholar, and will you as an author, in your avatar as an author, write an alternative answer to that book on the true